Welcome everyone to the Belonging Charla, hosted by the Hispanic Heritage Foundation, AARP, and Project Enya, as we share stories of identity, presence, balancing who we are and who we want to be. In other words, belonging. Belonging is a fundamental human need, no matter how much we fight it, which means that many of us will feel isolated if we don't feel like we belong. And in this great country we all share, we have been made to feel like the other by many, as we're told that we don't belong, sometimes in grocery stores, the workplace, across industries, and even by the highest elected officials. But we belong. As an example, I came here from Nicaragua as a boy. I didn't speak any English and then didn't feel like I belonged. And then I went back to Nicaragua after living in the United States, and I was made to feel like I didn't belong. And then I came back to the United States in a rural region and didn't feel like I belonged. So it's this whole journey where you just have to maneuver through these feelings and become more and more comfortable. Yesterday, I was actually speaking to a group from CADCA, and it was remarkable how much we all have in common in this journey, whether you're young, whether you're female, whatever it is, it's complicated. And let me just say this, in our own communities, in the Latinx communities, even though we don't like being made to feel like the other and like we don't belong, we make other Latinx feel like they don't belong. And we have to be really, really aware of how we treat our Black, female, Asian, Indigenous, Jewish, Muslim, disabled, LGBTQ plus siblings in terms of making everyone feel like they belong. We can't turn around and do the same thing we don't want done to us, to our own community, let alone everyone else. So we need to make sure like everyone belongs. And then the belonging subject comes up a lot in everything we do. It's everything from imposter syndrome to lack of confidence and even survivor's remorse, which I feel got even stronger during the pandemic. And sometimes after people around you are ill or dying or lose their homes, or you start feeling like, how am I okay during this time? Which of course then makes you not feel okay. So we have to really be in touch with all of those complex issues. And the issue of belonging and feeling like the other is so complex, and it is so personal. Often it's impacted by the environment that we grew up in, and even sometimes generational. Es complicado. So these charlas are where we can actually get personal to better understand each other in order to better support each other. This is a safe space to speak, listen, connect, and act in 5-minute increments. So we need your energy, we need your thoughts and your comments in the chat box. Please just make sure to take a moment right now to set it to everyone and not just the panelists. For some reason, that's the default, because we want everyone to hear you. This is also a moment to thank our special guest, Denise Soler Cox of Project Enya, who's extremely talented, and you need to go to her website. We're going to be dropping stuff in the chat from all of our speakers. And also, I want to thank our moderator, Veronica Segovia from AARP, for bringing this charla to life. And I want to thank all of these brave speakers. There is such a power in vulnerability, and to be able to talk about this topic is allowing you to be vulnerable in order to empower others. So thank you for that, everyone that's on here, including some very good friends that I have on here. So let me start with one good friend. Veronica Segovia is the senior advisor at AARP, working to impact lives across areas that matter most to Latinos and their families: health, wealth, and fun. If you had to sum it up, that's pretty good. Or as her team says, salud, dinero, y amor. In her role, she applies more than 10 years of experience in digital and social mobile communications to reach consumers on key issues of health, security, and financial resiliency across key channels. Prior to AARP, she worked online marketing and public relations with experience spanning agency, corporate, and nonprofits in the DC area. She speaks Spanish and holds a BA in communications, public relations from the University of Maryland, College Park, the mighty University of Maryland, College Park. She also serves on the board of governors for university's Alumni Association for its College of Arts and Humanities. Let's hear it, Veronica.
Mil gracias. Gracias, Antonio. I love when you introduce me. I love when I get to join these conversations. Like you said, vulnerability, safe space, psychologically safe space, belonging. It's something that we all have in common. It's all something we've experienced. It's a human need. So thank you so much. Like you mentioned, I'm the Senior Advisor for the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at AARP, and I have the honor and privilege of moderating today's Belonging Charla. As Tony mentioned, during today's program, we're going to hear from speakers discuss how the sense of belonging is complicated and has many layers, from years of exposure to influences that are external, and then also how they impact us internally. Something you said resonated with me. It's not in my script for today, but I did want to share, Tony, like you mentioned, just feeling for the first time in my life, I was born in the United States. I grew up speaking Spanish. For the first time in my life on Inauguration Day, when I was living in DC in 2017, I was doing what I normally do, walking my dog, talking to my mom on the phone, and I always speak to my mom in Spanish. And I saw a sea of red hats coming towards me. And for the first time in my life, I was afraid to speak Spanish in public and in DC, where I grew up. So I appreciate so much that we're having this conversation and that we're able to connect our community from all over the country. So that we can strive to create a safe and open environment, not only for our speakers, but our guests. And before we start, we want you to know that the views expressed and the stories shared are solely the opinion of each participant and not of HHF or our stakeholders, but that we honor them and that this is the safe space for them to share them. Also, on the chat box, make sure to change the option, like you said, to all panelists and attendees so we can see all the lovely comments and not just the panelists seeing them. We also encourage you to check out this and other content on hispanicheritage.org and the YouTube channel for Hispanic Heritage Foundation. Thank you again for participating, and we hope that you enjoyed today's Charla. And now to kick us off is our first speaker, Denise Soler Cox, who I saw speak at the last NCLR conference in 2017. NBC Latino calls Denise Soler Cox a voice for first-gen Latinos. Forbes calls her a trailblazing Latina. In 2014, she co-founded Project Enye, a multimedia production company whose purpose is to transform how we think about culture, identity, and what it means to belong. It is my honor to introduce and welcome Denise.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thanks for that. Of course, we had to have a technical difficulty as we end the pandemic with a good technical problem. So I want to say thank you so much to Hispanic Heritage Foundation, to Tony, to Veronica for having me on today. This is my absolute favorite thing to talk about. Belonging is really the culmination of the last 8 years of my life working with Project Enye, and it happens to be my very favorite subject. So really quick, in the chat, on a scale of 1 to 10, please share how excited you are to have this conversation today. On a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being you're super excited. So I know I'm super excited to be here, and I really want to capture how exciting is it to devote this amount of time with these amazing souls sharing from the heart today about what it means to belong. To me, it's kind of a mind-blowing thing, and I just want to acknowledge that right now. So yes, 10s, 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 and I'm a 10 as well. So because we're tackling a somewhat arbitrary thing that happens, something that seems very conceptual, it's also something very big, and we could see immediately Veronica sharing from the heart about it. So I just want to acknowledge that this might be a little bit hard. So I'd like to invite you to take a deep breath with me as we begin this conversation today. So let's all take one big deep breath together. That always feels good, right? Okay. So now what I'd like you to do is remember your first and earliest memory of belonging. I want you to go all the way back to your childhood and remember that first time that you felt what you would call belonging. Think about how old you were. Think about where you were, who was there, what was around you, that very first memory. And now I'd like you to see if you can think of a single word that describes that feeling, just one single word. And I'm going to invite you to write it down. And then for those of you that are okay, please share your word in the chat right now. So that very first memory of belonging, how old you were, who was there, what was happening, where were you? And what's the one word that describes that feeling? What are people writing?
Family, love, home, Puerto Rico, 7 years old.
Oh,
Feeling seen.
beautiful. Feeling seen. Puerto Rico. I love it.
Grandma.
Grandma, abuela. It's interesting, right? It feels different for all of us, but yet we all know when it's there and also when it's not. So now I'd like you to think about the times when you experienced not belonging. And in this group, with this crowd, I know that you're familiar with this feeling. I know that you know what it feels like to feel othered, to feel like you're on the outside looking in, like you don't have the right qualifications. Like, who are you to be here? Who are you to be standing where you're standing or to be in the job that you're at? I want you to feel those feelings right now so that we're all present to what it feels like not to belong. It's a very real feeling. And I don't necessarily want you to write it in the chat. I just want you to feel those feelings with me. So allow me to share with you a time when I also experienced that as well. So 7 years ago, when we were just getting started with a project, I was a mom to 2 daughters, 5 and 6 years old, and life was really good. I had made the decision to start Project Enya and to start making this film with my partner. And by all intents and purposes, things were going well until they weren't. And until I realized that making a film was a very expensive idea. And before I knew it, we didn't have enough money to pay our bills. And I was at a point of feeling like either I quit now and get a job, or I keep going and somehow find a way. And because I'm resourceful, and that's part of my Latinidad, I have to give my mother credit for that. There's always a solution to every single problem. I looked at my hand and I said, if I sold these wedding rings, I think we could pay all the bills that we needed to pay this month and next month even. So I shared it with my husband, and very unenthusiastically, he agreed to sell the rings so that I could keep going, making this film that I believed could heal a generation of people and make them feel like they belonged, because we deserve it, right? So we went to a place that bought and sold gold with our daughters and handed over our rings and received a check in return. We used that check to pay our bills. And I'll never forget that feeling when I looked at him and said, babe, we can't tell anyone we did this. This has to be our secret. I experienced so much shame on that drive and on the way home, and even using the money. It just felt wrong. But I did it because I needed that financial bridge to keep going. So things were great for a while. And 2 years after that, we ended up screening the film in New York City. And I was super nervous to share my heart and soul. And if you've seen Being Enya, you know that I'm very authentic in that film. And the night before, I recall having an argument with my partner, letting him know all that I had sacrificed to make this film and how scared I was for the next night, that everybody would hate it and then they would hate me and then all my sacrifices would be for naught. And it wasn't my finest moment. And anyway, I ended up sharing with him that I had sold my rings. And it was his idea to put that scene into the film. And so that scene in the film that you're familiar with actually was the very last scene that we added to the film. Totally scared, paranoid about this decision that I had made to agree to add this scene to the film. But here's what I learned. By deciding to share this thing that I experienced so much shame with, by deciding to put it on blast and put it in the film, I actually created belonging in every single room that this film was screened in. And I had no idea that sharing that and all the other things actually created belonging. in those rooms, just like this virtual room now, they were safe spaces. We could consider them safe spaces. And so all of the elements were there. I chose to be authentic and just be honest and step into my honest, authentic truth. You know what? I sold my ring so I could pay the bills. Yes, that's my truth. The second thing I chose to do was give myself permission, because no one is waiting to give me permission to be myself and to claim a space, right? And when we don't feel like we belong, we feel like we don't belong in the spaces and places that we want to be. And I needed to give myself permission and to lean into those spaces 100%, because no one was handing it out to me. And the third thing I did was I took a risk. I took a risk just like I'm taking a risk today, because there's some people here today that might not have seen the film, and I risk your judgment towards me. But I'm willing to take that risk in the name of belonging. I'm willing to take the risk so that I can actually create a container today of belonging for every single person that is here today, because it takes one single person, and Veronica did it and Tony did it by sharing authentically, right? So now it's just going to be a domino, and we are all together going to be creating belonging by sharing authentically, by deciding that we're not waiting for anyone to give us permission to be here doing this today, and by taking the risk and hoping and praying, right? Keeping our fingers crossed that it works, that people experience belonging. And at the end, we're going to check in and see if belonging was present. But my guess is, and my prediction is that it will have been. So what my invitation is to you is not to unabashedly and indiscriminately share, your scariest secrets with people. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is I would like to challenge you to really ask yourself, what is holding you back? What is holding you back from really being seen, really allowing yourself to be seen in the name of belonging for yourself, but also in the name of creating a space of belonging for other people? So that's my invitation for you today, is to lean into that, lean into the belief that you can create belonging in any space, in any place that you want to be. And then after you've mastered that skill, you can create belonging, just like the Hispanic Heritage Foundation has created for all of us today, anywhere and for anyone. So thank you so much for this opportunity. I cannot wait to hear the rest of the speakers. Mwah.
Thank you, Denise. I saw the film 4 years ago, and I've been just really excited about getting it in front of other people. And so thank you to Tony and the Hispanic Heritage Foundation team for being open to hosting a charla on belonging. So with that, let's kick off it with our speakers. And I'm partial to the very first one, who is Carmenza Millan, Senior Advisor for the Large Region at AARP. And she is my co-chair for the Latino Resource Group at AARP called Adelante. So Carmenza, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Veronica. I love this topic. No doubt that being a foreigner, being bicultural, bilingual has its compromises and challenges our sense of belonging. As Veronica mentioned, I am Dr. Carmenza Millan. I am a Colombian immigrant. In Colombia, we're all Colombianos, and our culture, customs are the same. We have some racial differences, but for the most part, we defined ourselves by our Colombian culture. My journey of belonging began when I landed at JFK Airport in 1966 with my mother and my brother. The year before that, my father had immigrated and was living in Queens, New York. I remember my mother pointing up to the glass that they had in the waiting area at that time and pointing and telling me, "There's your father." I was 7 years old and I had no recollection of him. I simply did not remember him. So I found myself as a child having to get reacquainted and, in a way, getting to know my father all over again. We arrived in August, and a month later in September, I attended public school. I got left back and had to repeat the second grade all over again because at that time, there was no bilingual education. It was the sink or swim method of learning English. What they would do is sit you next to a student that could interpret. I was seated next to a little boy from Ecuador. I was so embarrassed, actually mortified, when I had to tell him when I needed to go to the bathroom so that he could tell the teacher. In school, I quickly learned that I was seen as different. My name was different to people in this country, so the inclination was to shorten it to Carmen. I have fought very hard and still do to keep the integrity of my name. My lack of English led to some bullying. Kids would follow me and my brother on the way home, making fun, throwing things, that kind of stuff. That's when I first learned that not only was I different, but that some people thought that I didn't belong here. Also at that time, for the most part, people had not heard or knew where Colombia was, or those who had heard anything was negative, like that's where the best pot comes from. As a result of not knowing about Colombia, I was often labeled as Puerto Rican. It was also the first time I heard the word Hispanic to identify me. As I became more fluent in English and started to make friends, I didn't want to speak Spanish anymore. I didn't want anyone on the outside hearing me speak Spanish. I just wanted to be like my new friends. This became a major source of conflict with my father, who had a rule that Spanish would be spoken at home. I would speak with my mother in English and she would respond to me in Spanish. My father was so against this. He told her they will learn English outside, but in this house, we speak English, we speak Spanish. He was insistent when I spoke to him in English. He would tell me he did not understand me. This made me so incredibly angry, but today I credit him wholeheartedly and I'm grateful for his tenacity. If it was not for him, I would have lost my native language. It wasn't easy. There were lots of fights, tears, and frustration. My father was an old world, old-fashioned type of guy. As I grew into a teenager, there were no sleepovers, late night curfews, going away to college, and even having boyfriends. That's for the Americanizados, he would say. We don't do that here. For the most part, in my household, we lived like we were living in Colombia, with rules, ways of thinking, and upbringing like we were still there. But outside, I was becoming more and more like my gringa peers. But when I visited Colombia, my family would say, "Esta no es colombiana," and make fun of how I spoke Spanish with the gringa accent, they would say. All of my life, I have truly felt like I lived in two worlds, one foot as a Colombian and the other como una Americana, always straddling two cultures, one inside my home and the other outside of it, but not completely embraced by either. Now I live in Chicago, and here for the most part, we use the word Latino. So I always share my story that I originally did not know I was different, and it was only when I came here to the US that I went from Colombiana to Hispanic to Latina. It's been quite a journey filled with struggles, tribulations, joy, and sadness. Thank you for allowing me to share my story of belonging with you. Thanks again, and Veronica, I'll turn it back over to you.
Carmenza, thank you so much. Thank you, thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, so much of what you said resonated with me, and my cousins in Paraguay would always, and still do, you know, I'm a Yankee and criticize the way I speak Spanish. And I think talking about how people speak Spanish, or if they have even learned Spanish, that's a topic for a whole other charla too. So thank you for bringing that up and sharing your grace with us. So next we're going to Pabel Martinez, Global Account Director at TikTok and founder of Plural. He's joining us from New York. Pabel?
Thank you for that intro. Appreciate that. So, dímelo mi gente, happy Friday. So I'm here to convince you all that we need to redefine the word professionalism. And we need to do this so that more of us could feel like we belong at work and in these corporate spaces. Let's first just even look at the actual definition of professionalism. The competence or skill expected of a professional. Literally nowhere in that definition does it say how a person should dress, speak, do their hair, or even look. Yet, when you imagine or hear the word professionalism, what do you think about? Who do you imagine? For most of my life, I never imagined someone that looked like me. To be honest, I just imagine a white person in a suit. And the reason for that is because we've been trained to believe for so long that so many parts of our identity are unprofessional. I remember growing up, my mom literally every day, every morning before going to work would literally transition from this curly haired Dominican to this straight haired employee that tried to blend in with her coworkers. My grandfather growing up would tell me, "Hey, do you see CEOs, presidents with beards, earrings, do-rags, tattoos? I don't think so. So dress accordingly." I understood what they were trying to do directly was to shield me from people's negative perceptions, but indirectly, what they didn't realize that they were doing was that they were telling me that in order to be successful, I couldn't be myself. They were telling me that my identity and so many parts of my identity and my culture that I was embracing were unprofessional. Unfortunately, these ideas are often reinforced at work. Many of us experience microaggressions and even racism that makes it difficult for us to belong. So what do most of us do? We suppress parts of our identity. We hide who we are to not be seen. We hide who we are and instead change it for our work persona so that we can build relationships with senior leaders, because that's ultimately how you grew up in corporate America. And for so long, I thought I was alone. But then I read research from the Center of Talent Innovation in the Harvard Business Review that said 76% of us suppress parts of our identity. That's 3 out of every 4 of us. If you open your speaker view to more of a grid format, look up, down, to the right, left, it's probably everyone around you, if not you yourself. And to be honest, it was exhausting. And my career didn't start flourishing until I embraced and accepted that my identity and what makes me different was actually my superpower. So under the parent company Plural, I launched a podcast called Quien Tú Eres to really tell the stories of our community and the conflict that we often face between professionalism and authenticity. Because I want more people to know that they are professional, that they do belong in these corporate competitive spaces. Their voice matters and they deserve to be where they are. Some of the feedback that I received was that listening to the podcast actually inspired them to be more of themselves. Because when you are yourself, what you end up doing is you become a mirror and people see themselves in you. And by doing that, by seeing themselves in you, they say, wow, Pabel is being himself. He's actually saying his opinion in a meeting. I can be myself. And the cycle continues. So the only way that we're actually going to redefine professionalism and make people feel as if they belong is by being our most authentic selves. So I invite you to listen to the episodes on the Quien Tú Eres podcast. If you're comfortable, tell your story, but most importantly, be yourself, because it's the only way that we're going to belong. And I'll leave you with this. Was it easy for me? No, it was met with resistance. And I can, if I had more than 5 minutes, I can definitely get into some of those stories, but it was worth it. And I'll say that I went from trying to belong and be part of a group that didn't accept me into belonging with the community and support system that I was ultimately looking for so long. So be yourself and let's redefine professionalism together. Thank you.
Love that. Love it, Pabel. Love everything you're doing. Quien Tú Eres is the name of the podcast. People were asking. Maybe we can drop it in chat. If you got links, if you got social, put it in there. Everyone is loving what you're saying. So I love it, love it, love it. All right. And next we are going to Ish Verdusco, author of How Successful People Get Ish Done. Joining us from Los Angeles, California. Take it away, Ish.
Hello. What's going on, everybody? So my full name is actually Ismael Verdusco el Tercero, but we'll just save that entire story for another day. Why I don't go by that name. Thank you for having me. So I come from a super humble Mexican-American background here in Los Angeles. It's a beautiful day here as well. And I actually attended a small college called UC Merced in the Central Valley. So I'm not sure how many people that are in the chat or people that are here dialing in know where UC Merced is. It's a really small school. I mean, proud how much it's grown now. But when I attended, there were only about 3 or 4 graduating classes before me. And I remember graduating, being super excited, to finally enter the workforce. And I think I applied to about 150 jobs over the course of like 4 or 5 months in my senior year of college and got rejected by all of them. Every single one. I only got a couple of actual job interviews in person. And I distinctly remember like employers laughing and saying like, you went to UC what? Like, is that a real school? And because the school was so new and extremely diverse, it's a great school, it's accredited school. I remember people like laughing. I even remember like applying to these different like career sites, and UC Merced wouldn't even pop up. It would be at UC Berkeley, all different schools. And eventually I landed a job, like a temporary job at 24 Hour Fitness, which is a gym here in Southern California. I moved in with my parents, and through the grace of God, I landed a contract job at LinkedIn, and that's where I got my start, my start as into tech. And it was a dream of mine to always work at LinkedIn ever since, you know, I was like maybe 18 or 19 years old, because I always wanted to work in social media. I wanted to work in tech. And I remember like getting there my first week and looking around into the office and being like, yo, where are all the people of color? Like, is this a joke? It was like, it literally felt like a movie. I could not believe how ostracized I felt at the time. Like, I could literally look through the entire office space and not see another person of color. And that I was in complete shock. I remember like feeling like such an outsider because I didn't understand the lingo, the behaviors, the subtle things, like going to eat cheese and drink wine and not understanding like how to do that or how to select the different wines, because I was just used to like beer and like tequila and stuff like that, you know? And I distinctly remember volunteering to speak at an event aimed at helping young Black and brown students like just like grow as professionals. And this was at LinkedIn. I was asked to be a speaker. And right after the session, one of the other speakers that was on the panel with me looked over and said, wow, I can't believe some of the stories that I heard from these kids. Like, they've really been through a lot. He said, one of the kids that I spoke to lost their dad growing up. I can't even imagine that. And I thought to myself, I didn't say it, but I thought to myself, like, wow, I lost my dad when I was 12 years old. Does that make me more of them than I am of you at this company? I didn't say that because I didn't feel comfortable in my own skin. It was just really odd, because I remember another specific story. I was in the marina in San Francisco with some friends that we all worked in tech, and we all were people of color. And I had my LinkedIn backpack on. And the marina is not a very diverse place, for those of you who don't know San Francisco very well. But I remember these tech bros just standing around at the bar, and one of them whispering, he probably just landed a job at LinkedIn because they had a diversity goal to meet. And I couldn't believe it. Like, I can hear you, idiot, you know? And I took all the power in me to not fight this guy because I didn't want to make a scene. But that's just like countless stories of not feeling that I belonged. And it was just odd, because for the first time in my life, I really felt like I had to be somebody who I wasn't. Like, I Monday morning would roll around 8 a.m. and I would put on a mask. And then Friday would roll around 4 p.m., take the mask off and go hang out with my friends, and finally feel like I could breathe and relax. It was the most uncomfortable, intimidating thing that I've ever been through. And it would just make me feel nervous, just like doing things that I knew I was capable of doing, which I'm sure showed in my work, and my performance wasn't as great. But it just was really uncomfortable. I remember doubting myself, that imposter syndrome just kicking in really hard every single day, speaking before a meeting and feeling your heart just like beat really, really hard, not knowing if it was like over caffeine or you're just really nervous. And then on top of all that, like, I was in my early 20s, just really young. I remember thinking to myself, damn, they messed up by letting me in here. They probably made the wrong hire. I shouldn't be here. And I remember one day, I was in the San Francisco office. Somebody walked up behind me speaking Spanish. And I was like, what the heck, who's speaking Spanish? The first time I hear Spanish, like in the weeks that I've been here. And that person was a person by the name of Hector. Hector ended up being my mentor and one of the people who saved me in tech. He basically made me feel like I could be myself. He made me feel like I can speak my own thoughts. He made me feel like, you know, I could just didn't have to hide my identity. And fast forward to 6 years to now, 6 years later, 7 years later, it's my personal commitment to help and drive impact for people from underrepresented groups. I do that through books, events like this, speaking engagements, podcasts, and anything that I can. So thank you all for having me here and for letting me share a piece of my story. I appreciate you all, and have a wonderful day.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I have to find your book, because you are, I hope you know, you are one of these successful people getting ish done. So thank you for sharing your story with us.
Gracias.
Next, we're going to go to Luz Maria Mack. She's a bilingual storyteller and producer, and she's joining us from the Bronx.
Hi, everyone. How are you? Thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited. So I want to start by sharing my story. So when my daughters got into private school, my youngest came to this realization that she was different. And the way it came about was she wanted to be like her friends. And there's nothing wrong with that. We all go through these moments of wanting to be like everyone else, to be like the bigger group, right? So it turned out that she asked me, Mommy, can you cut my hair, make me blonde, and make my hair straight? And that's when it landed. And I was like, my baby no longer loves her updo curly hair. It hit so hard as a mother. And for me, it was a moment of like, how can I help her embrace her beauty within and love the way she looks? So I kept looking at those big brown eyes, her curly hair updo, just tugging away at me. For those who are moms or parents, you know what I'm talking about. Mommy, please, mommy, please. There was no time to waste. In her mind, we needed to do this ASAP, now, ahora. So that reminded me so much of when I was in school and this need to feel like to fit in. So I couldn't believe how all these feelings started rushing through me. So I wanted to do something to help. So it turned out that I went to school the next day. I spoke to her teacher and I said, hey, everyone, my daughter's feeling like she doesn't fit in, almost like she wanted to look like her friends. What can I do? Like any mother who wants to make her child feels like they fit in, to make sure that she knows that she belongs there. And her teachers were like so amazing. They were so awesome. They actually told me, make sure when you have a moment, you show her pictures of family members, important historical figures, people that look like her, so she could start understanding that her beauty is something that it's known, although we didn't see it in the larger picture. So what did I do? I started a new form of storytelling at home. Every time I would get my daughters at nighttime and I would tell them about their family members, stories about their grandparents that they haven't met, that have passed away, about their aunts, their uncles, to friends, historical figures. I started, since I'm Dominican, I started with the Mirabal sisters. Why were they so important? Why were they so influential? And how they look like them. And Harriet Tubman, Martin Luther King, Gandhi, the list goes on to all the way to current figures like Barack and Michelle Obama, Oprah, Jennifer Lopez. I mean, we're Latinos. I wanted to show the variety of our complex and beautiful culture, but I wanted her to know that she was no different from that. So this actually hit home for me because I decided to tell her about me and how I grew up in the Dominican Republic, because I wanted her to understand who I was. Because part of storytelling was for me to share with her how I fit into all this. How does her father fit into all this? So it led me to write my first children's book. And I couldn't believe that that experience led me to that moment of writing my first book. And let me tell you, I had no clue what I was doing. No one in my family's ever written a book before. And can I tell you that when I told them I was going to write a book for my daughter, they were like, oh, sure. Aquí tiene un papel y un lápiz. Knock yourself out. They really didn't understand I wanted to write a book for my daughter. So I did that. And just to give you some context, little Chloe's experience, my daughter's experience, speaks not only to my daughter, but to many children that look like her, children that are from different backgrounds and families that work hard to make sure that their children know that they belong and there's a place for them. According to 2019 Cooperative Children's Book, only 5.5 of children's books are about Latinx culture. So let that sink in. So that means the kids, when they were growing up, they don't see themselves in books, they don't see themselves in content. And then we're expecting them to know they're beautiful and special. And also our educational spaces, I don't want to say all, because many of them are making tremendous efforts for our kids to see themselves and know of their culture and their beauty, didn't see themselves. So I was really concerned and I wanted to do something for my child. So after I wrote that book, I remember I read a quote, and this quote was from Louise Rosenblatt, and this was 80 years ago. It says, she's a widely known scholar of literature. She articulated that we understand ourselves through characters and stories, but yet none of our kids get to see that. So I wanted to do something for her. And little did I know, when I was doing something for her, I was doing something for myself to find where I belong in that space. It's important to have diversity in children's book because they need and deserve to see themselves in stories. They should see colors, characters, and stories that speak to them and that resonate with them. So they know, like, this is familiar, this is family, this is who I am. And let me show you how that looks like if time permits. Oh, I can't share my screen, so that's okay.
Rose, that's okay. Maybe we can figure it out for Q&A and we can bring it back.
Yeah.
I'd love if you can, I mean, maybe this is what you were hoping to share with us, but like the cover of your book so that we can see the name of your book. And so we'll get to it.
Yeah, but I wanted to show you how it started. This is the cute little girl with the updo that was begging me to be blonde. And although I can't show it in the presentation, I'm glad I held to this picture. And I was going to show you a picture. Oh, there she is. And if you see on my next slide, this is what it looks like when kids feel included and they're seen. In all my books, kids said, there's my hair, there's my family, there's my culture, there's who I am. And I was going to end with that, but I'm glad you started it, because the topic of belonging is a topic of love, and that's all we need. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Luz Maria. Thank you so much. Oh, thank you for sharing. You're making the world a better place, and I have a 2-year-old son, so I can't wait to get your book.
Thank you.
Next, we're going to Eli Palacios, Regional Educator Effectiveness Specialist, who's joining us from Edinburgh, Texas. Or Edinburgh. Go ahead, Eli.
Hi, Eli. So I'm going to jump right in, tell you a little bit about my story. I am a second or third generation Texican or Mexican American from Texas, regardless of how you see it, depending on which parent you're asking about. But I grew up with Spanish as my first language. I never say English as my second language. I'm proud of my first language, and I won't let anybody take that from me. But I will share with you that I grew up with parents who were first and second generation Mexican Americans who were brought up to literally have the Spanish switched out of them. They would be taken out to the tree and hit if they were speaking Spanish in class. So I will still remember to this day the very first time that they got a call from school telling them that the only way to help me learn English and fast was to switch everything in the house to English. From music to TV to family gatherings, my parents didn't hesitate. They jumped right in. And as a result of that, I kind of just lost my South Texas or Texican Mexican accent. And this was made obviously and glaringly apparent when I showed up to a different district in 6th grade, and I heard very often, you don't quite sound like us. And I get it, I didn't, right? I think that years later, I realized that this was generational cultural trauma that I was going through and that I was having to work my way through. Things that my parents didn't quite figure out, but they figured they didn't want me to go through what they went through. But because of this, from a very young age, I started this feeling of never feeling like enough, right? Never quite feeling like what I did was enough. It led to me being an overachiever early on. I graduated 6th in my class, went off to an Ivy League, went off to Brown University on the East Coast. And I spent most of my time there focusing on my academics, right? First year there, focusing on my academics, not really caring about my identity or wanting to talk about it or figure it out, just focusing on school. That's what I was there for, but focusing on whether or not I really belonged there at an Ivy League institution. And I'll share with you on a side note that that came with a whole lot of trauma in and of itself, dealing with things like academic probation, because I wasn't dealing with things that were important to who I was, dealing with things like uncertainty about financial aid, all of those things. Thankfully, though, it was at Brown where I found my Brown crowd. I know it sounds a little redundant and nonsensical, but for me, finding those people gave me the space and permission to just be me, to own my language in whatever form it came, to own my looks and my lack of melatonin for most parts of the year, honestly. From food to my experiences with music and dance. And it was at Brown where I found permission to reclaim my Latinidad, right? From my Cuban Italian best friend from Queens, New York, from my Guatemalan Cuban best friend from originally from Miami, now living in DC, from my Mexican born best friend from Chicago, and all of my Latinx friends from Minnesota to Arizona. And yes, other Texicans from where I was from as well. And I think it was through these relationships that I realized there just wasn't one way to be Latinx, right? That enough was this elusive term that for most of us, we had this finish line in our heads. And every time we were about to get there, we just moved the finish line somewhere else, right? And so it was through this space with them that I learned to reclaim my language. Now, I will say that for quite some time, my Spanish sounded a little more Dominican and Puerto Rican than it did Mexican, and I loved it. I embraced every moment of that. But then I came back to South Texas and I began working in school districts where the majority of my students were just like me, Mexican or Texican, a few generations removed, but still grappling with how their language and their culture were assets instead of a hindrance. And I returned to the classroom where I used cognates to activate learning in kids, and I used Spanish to build relationships with parents, which I wouldn't have been able to do if I hadn't grabbed that back at Brown. And 7 years into my teaching was the first time that I actually had my first full conversation completely in Spanish. And I remember still to this day being thrown back because I thought somehow I had arrived at this finish line that I had put in my head, right? And it was enough for me at the time, but I went back to school eventually to earn my master's degree. I earned it with a 4.0, by the way. But I earned it with embracing every single part of who I was and how different I was. And I'll tell you, to this day, I think one of the first conversations that I had with Denise, I told her that I'd been holding on to my breath, trying to feel like what enough was. And it wasn't until I watched her film that I said to myself, that's it. Even though I'm not a first generation person, it's exactly what it was. It's the reason why my food will never be exactly like my parents. It's a reason why my Spanish sounds a little different than my parents. But I tell you, my food just tastes just as good, if not better, I might say. But it's also why I continue to do that work on my own. I was talking to my wife a little earlier, and I'm going to share with you, I wasn't planning on, but I'm going to share with you a message that she sent me just a little bit ago. I told her being on here, I'm like, I'm getting that feeling again, the feeling of not being enough. Who am I to be on a panel sharing my experience with the world? And she said, and I quote, "You're an Ivy League educated queer Latinx non-binary pastor from South Texas. You're living life out loud, happy, and you're doing the thing." I added that last part, but I am. And so I want to share with you that sometimes it feels as though it was a lot easier to come out as queer than it was to ever embrace my Latinidad, because, it is what it is, but it is your own personal journey. So for everyone out there who showed up today feeling like we're not enough, or this line is something we never reach, it's okay. You're enough just as you are.
Gracias, Eli. You are enough. Thank you. You're doing the thing. Next, we're going to Abigail Golden Vasquez, consultant and previous executive director of the Latinos in Society program at Aspen Institute. And she's joining us from Washington, D.C. Take it away, Abigail.
Thank you, Veronica, and thank you, Tony, for inviting me to be a part of this, and to all the panelists or speakers, inspirers is what I'm going to call you, for sharing your journeys, your stories of belonging. Each one of you is inspiring, and I'm taking in something from every one of you. So thank you. So the title of my charla is there's no box for me to check, and that's okay. I was going to call it ni de aquí, ni de allá, because that's another way that I think we often are felt, and I've heard that throughout the conversation. But I don't fit into your box was something that I came up with after one of my colleagues at the Aspen Institute, Michelle Norris, who started the Race Card Project, came up with this concept of whittling things down to their most essential and simplest terms. And so she asks everyone to talk about race in 6 words. And so my 6 words are, I don't fit into your box. But I wanted to add that that's okay. That's okay. So I was born in New York City to a Puerto Rican mother and a Jewish father. It was absolutely unheard of at the time. It was sort of like West Side Story, but without the gangs, the knives, or the Italians. It was the yarmulkes and the Jews and the Puerto Ricans, the arroz con pollo. Neither side of my family was happy with that union. So my earliest memories of non-belonging really began inside my own family. In my earliest memories, I didn't feel Puerto Rican enough for my Puerto Rican family, not because of anything they ever did, ever. It's just that I didn't speak Spanish at the time, and I was lighter than the rest of my cousins, and I was aware that I had this white side of my family, and it just was in my consciousness. And at the same time, with my Jewish family, I felt I always had to prove that I was good enough, that somehow my Puerto Ricanness was some sort of deficit that I had to overcome. And this is a true story. My Jewish granny, now I don't know why she wanted to be called granny, because that just sounds old to me, but that's how she liked to be called. She would tell her friends when my mom and dad were dating that she was Venezuelan instead of Puerto Rican, because to her that was preferable, because Venezuelans at the time, remember it was an oil-rich country, were glamorous and Puerto Ricans were not. So, so when I was 4, my parents separated, and my mom went to nursing school, and she met my stepfather, Craig, who is a Black pre-med student from Detroit. And we soon moved to Nashville, Tennessee, to an all-Black neighborhood. And I was actually bused to school with all my neighbors, who were predominantly Black, to the white school. And on the bus, I was being bullied by a 5th grader and for being white. And when my mom prodded me and pushed me to figure out why I was hedging and procrastinating getting on the bus, I finally confessed that I was being bullied for being white. So she, being the New Yorican that she is, came to the bus stop, pulled the girl aside and said, "Look, my daughter's Puerto Rican, and that's the same as being Black." Now, I don't know if that actually resonated with the girl, but she also said, "I'm counting on you to make sure nothing happens to my daughter. And if something does, you're going to have to contend with me." So I would say that this young girl begrudgingly protected me for the rest of the year. It was without any joy whatsoever. However, I was not bothered again. So that's just a few examples early on of just not sort of belonging anywhere. Meanwhile, my dad stayed in Oregon, where he started a commune, which didn't work out, like most communes of the time didn't. But I would spend my summers there, and I even went to spend 3rd grade there in this lily white, small, rural, working poor town in in Wolf Creek, Oregon. And so again, I didn't quite fit in to what the norm was there. So I started to get used to that, actually. It wasn't such a bad thing after a period of time. I learned that my mom was pregnant with my brother Mateo, and I used that as an excuse to get out of, at the time, what for me was like this little bumfuck town. Excuse my French, sorry, Tony. My mom had by then moved to San Francisco, and we lived right above the Mission District on Potrero Hill. And if you know anything about, dating myself now, if you know anything about San Francisco in the 70s, Potrero Hill was kind of like a hippie hill, and it was sandwiched right smack between the Mission District, which was largely Mexican, if not all Mexican, and the Black projects, which were right above. And we were sandwiched between them. So again, I didn't really have an idea of where I belonged. And so soon I was a wannabe chola. I wore all black, I wore Dickies, I wore the plastic bands that you would get at the bracelets and rings that you would get at the hardware store. My apodo was La Diabla Inocente, because I thought that was like kind of tough, but not too tough, which kind of, that's where I was willing to be. I was bad, but not too bad. And our middle school there, Potrero Hill Middle School, was divided into racial and ethnic groups completely. So there was a Chicano gang, several. There were Samoan gangs, there were Black gangs, and the Samoans were the scariest gangs. But there wasn't really a gang for me. I didn't quite fit in. There were no Jewish gangs or Puerto Rican gangs. So I mostly hung with the Mexicans, but still I didn't quite belong. And so around this time, I must have asked my mother or explained to her what was going on, because she said, just tell everyone you're the New York combination. And I thought, okay, well, that's not really going to fly. Thanks, Mom. I don't think that's going to resonate at Potrero Hill Middle School, but that was okay. So despite all this dislocation and identity confusion, Mommy was always super proud of being Puerto Rican. I mean, like mega proud, like, megaphone proud. So she danced salsa anytime there was, any kind of community affairs or events. She was always the first one up there dancing, and she was loud, and she was a champion for all underdogs. And she was a Lolita Lebron loving, Black power, anti-establishment, force to be reckoned with. So while I had no sense of where I belonged, slowly, I also began to become grounded in this sense that something about my difference actually made me unique and special. It might have been that she was constantly whispering that in my ear, but I eventually came to absorb that being Puerto Rican was cool and being mixed was my superpower. Mommy always made me feel like I was the best of both worlds, the best of both heritages. And so it took so long for that to sink in. And after many years of going back to being professional, after many years of straightening my hair and trying to be professional, I came to believe that who I was and what I came from is precisely what makes me special. And beyond that, that in a way made me most American. This is what America is, not a melting pot. It's more of like a gumbo or a paella or a stew of many different ingredients, but absolutely delicious. So if you, like me, don't feel you fit into a single box, that's okay. You truly are what it means to be American, and you belong. And I'll just add one more thing. As Latinos, we represent every race, ethnicity, religion, gender. So we should be a place where everyone belongs. There's no room for caste, racism, sexism, or homophobia. Thank you.
Yes, yes, that is so true. Yes, thank you. Next, we have Vanessa Correa, multifamily marketing communications senior professional at Freddie Mac, and you're joining us from Fairfax City. So Vanessa, take it away.
So great to meet you all. Thank you, Tony, for inviting me. I love to hear your stories. I'm going to jump right in. I'm dyslexic, so I get a lot of things backwards. And for me, it's kind of like I had the opposite reaction to someone trying to exclude me. If someone told me that I didn't belong, I considered that they were doing me a favor. I was born and raised in the Bronx. My parents were both born on Puerto Rico. My father was muy rebelde. He got kicked out of all three branches of the government, of the Army, the Marines, and the Navy. I consider that an accomplishment. He didn't let anybody tell him who to be. So I always had that attitude from very young. There were other things that went into it. I took dance classes, which gave me a lot of confidence. I was always performing. And I realized very early on that I was special. And whoever had a problem with that, that was their problem, because ain't nobody got time for that. So I've always been naturally confident and felt like, I don't belong here. I'll find something else. I'll find something better. It's their loss. And so for me, I want to actually talk about you, the viewer, those of you, 100 or so of you who are in this charla. People have kind of always asked me along the years, I'm not as young as I look, how are you so confident and why? And so the first thing I want to get out of the way is that we can fool ourselves, just like we can, belong, and we can find our genuine, we're on our journeys to find what's real. We can also fake it. And I would just encourage you not to do that. You don't have to do that. Just because you made it doesn't mean you belong. Just because you got into that group or you got into that job, don't fool yourself. Live a genuine life, because, who wants a midlife crisis, right? Next slide. You can belong to yourself first. That's the most important thing. For me, belonging to yourself, knowing yourself is what helps you find your footing and find your path. If you don't know yourself, you're not going to belong anywhere. You belong to yourself first. That's Liz Lemon giving herself a high five in 30 Rock. I am a New Yorker. I am that old. I've seen the whole series. So these are the 3 things that I want to quickly share with you. Next slide. So you see here some famous artists. I had seen these images over the years and not realized that they are all self-portraits. That is a self-portrait of Warhol, Dali, Kahlo. It is really important, even for classical artists, to look at themselves and spend time knowing themselves. Next slide. So you've heard these questions before. I'm not going to read them to you, but I'm going to take them a step further. When you answer these questions for yourself, don't judge yourself. If you're in a situation and you're like, I'm supposed to like this, I'm supposed to fit here, this is supposed to feel good. Like, we have feelings about our feelings. So I want to encourage you not to do that. Again, ain't nobody got time for that. Don't feel some type of way about the fact that inside of you, something's just not right. Listen to yourself and accept yourself for who you are and for who you're not, and be okay with it, and learn to share that with others. Next slide. You're going to have to create some new definitions. Everyone, these are the top 3 words that we talk about in life. Success. If your parents struggled, if your mother walked across the desert from Mexico so that you could be a doctor and you don't want to be a doctor, or you're failing all your medical classes, eso quebra el corazón y lo parte en dos. You know what I mean? Like, you want to make your mommy happy, but that's just not for you. Growth to someone, we all have very different definitions of growth. Growth for you is not the same as growth for me. And so I'm going to suffer from a sense of lacking of belonging if I don't know what is my own definition of growth. And lastly, value, right? There's different types of value. No one can decide for you what value you should be bringing into the world, what you're going to worry about when you're on your deathbed, right? So you need to do that for yourself. And lastly, in the next slide, it's not easy. I'm in marketing now. This is my 3rd career. I taught English as a second language in South Korea for 3 years. I did my master's in publishing. I was a publisher for a few years. I belonged for a hot minute, a couple years, 2 years, 3 years. But it's something that you can't give up on. It takes a lot of confidence, yes, but also endurance and a lot of consistency. Know your value proposition. When anyone tries to make you feel like you don't belong at this table, I have my value proposition memorized. I can tell you 3 reasons why not only do I belong at that table, but I should speak first. And if you make me leave, I'm gonna tell you that it's gonna be very hard to replace me. So definitely, keep your focus on you and the fact that you belong to yourself first, and the rest will follow.
Vanessa, I know I'm not the only one who needed to hear that today. We belong to ourselves. I belong to myself. It's just so helpful. It's just really impacted me and resonated with me so beautifully. So thank you so much for sharing with us today and for being with us today. Israel Tovar is our next speaker, high school teacher, co-founder of Dream Teacher Project, and 2013's national recipient for the Hispanic Heritage Youth Awards in the field of education. So Israel, joining us from DC, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. My name is Israel Tovar. My pronouns are he, él. As mentioned, I'm located in Washington, DC, and I'm a high school social studies teacher here. I was born in Tijuana, Mexico, but when I was 4, my family and I immigrated to Los Angeles. And then when I was 12, we moved again, but this time to Nashville, Tennessee. Moving to Nashville was such a huge formative experience because I was forced to grapple with my racialized existence in the US. It was for the first time where I was asked, where are you from? Where are you really from? Why do you talk that way? Growing up in LA and Mexico, I thought, everyone was Mexican or Mexican American. But then moving to Nashville, I was forced to really grapple with the fact that that was not the case. So I realized that school was going to be my ticket out of poverty, my ticket out of Nashville from the South. And so I excelled in school. And I ended up going to Yale University for undergrad and then Stanford for graduate school. While at Stanford, I fell in love with teaching. I was teaching Mexican American history in San Jose. And when I graduated from Stanford, as a first-gen immigrant who's really family-oriented, really missed my family. And so I decided to move back to Nashville. And I taught social studies middle school there. But when I was in Nashville again, I felt so incredibly lonely, being the only Latino male educator at my school and one of the few Latino male educators in the entire city. And also one of the few openly gay teachers in the city. And so because of that, I decided to move again to DC, and I've been teaching here for the past 2 years. I've been teaching at a school that serves primarily low-income Black and Brown students. In the 3 places that I've taught, I've either been the only Latino male educator or the only openly queer teacher, and that's been a very tough experience, but one that has deeply shaped how I view and navigate the world today. As a product of these experiences and as a teacher with these intersecting identities, my sister and I launched the Dream Teacher Project. Through this initiative, we hope to foster a community in which teachers of color don't feel lonely and are able to do this very important work. This work that has the power to transform the lives of young people. Research has actively shown that we are being pushed out, teachers of color are being pushed out of the teaching profession at alarmingly high rates for a wide array of systemic issues. So we want the Dream Teacher Project to tackle some of these issues head on. Research also highlights, and my own experience corroborates this research, the profound impact that teachers of color have on their students, specifically on students of color. So I'll end with this sweet note that one of my students wrote to me a couple years ago. I wish my loving teacher knew how happy I am that I have a teacher who looks like me and talks like me, other than my Spanish teacher. So thank you so much for your time today. La lucha sigue, and we're in this struggle together.
Israel, I wish I had a teacher who looked like you, who sounded like you, who just is as smart and impressive as you. Thank you so much for what you're doing and for the future. I know we have time for Q&A. Somehow it's a miracle. The universe works in wonderful ways, and we have about 20 minutes. Denise, I know you wanted to hop on and honor what's been shared here. There's just so much. My heart is full. I extend wholehearted thanks to Antonio and his team at Hispanic Heritage Foundation, and to Yvette Peña, because I know she's on here and she's my boss and she works at AARP, and she's very supportive of the work that and this conversation that we wanted to have today. So Denise, anything you wanna say before I go to the questions? Okay, I'm gonna go to Q&A. We've got some, and I see a couple. I'm gonna start with one, how do we listen to your podcast? So I think we can put it in chat, some links to your podcast. We definitely want to be able for folks to listen to the Quien Tú Eres podcast. Denise, is that you? Okay. And then the next question that I have is for you, Carmenza. So, and I'm going to read it as it's phrased. It's, do you hold any resentment to the term Latina because you mentioned how hard that journey from Colombiana to Hispanic to Latina was? So Carmenza, can you talk a little bit about your feelings?
Sure, I'd be happy to, yeah. Thanks, Veronica. Yes, and I did start, when I started sharing my story, I said, being an immigrant, being bicultural, being bilingual has, we sometimes need to make accommodations. It has its challenges and compromises. And it's an interesting question because, when I am usually surrounded with Latinos, our natural inclination, we always ask, like, where are you from? So I will more than anything say, soy colombiano, or I am from Colombia.
I can't hear anything from here.
Oftentimes what happens though, if I'm with a general population group of among Caucasians, and they're not really sure, I will actually use the word Latina. And to me, it's a good compromise in the sense that it's a little bit closer to Latino America. So it's a good compromise. I'm a little bit more hesitant to identify as a Hispanic. It's sort of like a government census term, I always feel. So not so much resentment, but I think I see it before. It's like we've learned to adapt. I heard the word chameleon, that ability to shift and back and forth between our cultures. So I would say probably not so much anymore as a piece of resentment.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I'd open that question up for any of the panelists. If you want to talk a little bit about, those boxes, not fitting into a box. I appreciated so much what you mentioned, Ish, about overhearing someone refer to you as a diversity hire. That is, I've thought about it as a DEI practitioner, like, is there a way that I can reclaim this term diversity hire, but think about it from like how we elevate this shit, like, and how it's actually higher. It's not HR, it's not HIRE, but it's HIGHER, right? Like, how do we, how do we reclaim that? So I don't know if others wanted to chime in on the Latinidad, Latinx, Latino, Latina. I'd love to hear from anyone.
This is Vanessa. I work in corporate America. This is the first time I've been working in corporate America. I lovingly call corporate America the suits, and I grew up wanting nothing to do with the suits because I'm not a suit and I'm not sorry. For me though, knowing two things. Number one, both my parents are Puerto Rican. My mom sat me down when I was a kid and was like, look, we got everybody. We got people who look like they're Irish. We got Black Puerto Ricans. We got tan, like, she made it that what our identity was a mix of everybody, and that's why Puerto Ricans are so beautiful. So diversity hire for me, like, I get when people are trying to make it an insult and they're like, the only reason you're here is because we had to check that box, or we had this quota, or we needed to diversify so we don't look racist. I like to, again, I'm dyslexic. I like to spin things around. If somebody wants to throw that at me, I first and foremost don't react from a place of ego. I react from a place of just feeling sorry for the person. Like, hey, it's not my fault that I speak 2 languages. I have lived in 5 places. I can be in this crew. I can be in that crew. I can do 5 times as many things as you, and I'm not getting 5 times the salary. So I tend to flip it. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, it's a diversity hire. When people want to get like negative like that or toxic like that in the workplace, I honestly just take it as a compliment and allow the negativity to propel me to remind myself how special I am and that I'm not apologetic about that. Like, if you want to think that the only reason I'm here is because I'm female and because I'm Latina, you could go ahead and think that. I'm gonna be busy climbing this ladder and leaving you behind. So, it sucks when that people are talking about you like that, but that's just the way that I am with everything personally and professionally. I use negativity as fuel to stay positive and to remember that I have so much to offer. That's probably why they're mad.
I think if I can add on to that, Vanessa, just something that growing up in South Texas, I still hold on to the term Texican, right? I combine both things, but I'm still Latinx. I'm non-binary. I'm queer. I'm a queer Christian, which almost never comes up anywhere, right? And so part of what I think I understand is that for me and people around me, and probably everybody here also, like, our existence is a form of resistance, but also that resistance isn't for everybody. Sometimes it's just for me. I don't need to prove anything to you. The spaces that I occupy are mine, and sometimes you can be in them too. So that's kind of the feeling about that.
I loved that. Can I chime in here? I don't know.
Yep, we can hear you.
whatever it is, so whatever the name, whatever the label, one of the things, unfortunately, that I've been criticized for is to, just another label to put on our community, right? Not everybody, just a few people, but it has happened. And I'm not attached to a label. What I do care about is that you feel powerful in the spaces that you occupy. And belonging really is a declaration. And sometimes there will, as so many people here know and are familiar with, there will be people that don't look like you, sound like you, they won't be where you're from, they will not have your life experience, and you still need to create your own belonging in that space and claim it 100%. And so what I feel our work is about is making sure that you're equipped with that confidence and equipped with that belief that you can occupy that space until that moment when you're like, wait a second, I'm like operating here like I belong, and now I can take some other people with me.
Can I just chime in here and add to what you've said and what others have said? And I think that we got to acknowledge that, I mean, forget anyone who says you're here on a diversity hire or whatever that is. We bring something that you don't have, and frankly, you're going to need. And so I think I said this in another conversation later, like, I'm not here to do anybody a favor. I'm doing, this is not a nice thing to just sort of like have a Latino here. I'm doing you a favor because you are going to get, and this is to your point, Vanessa, you're getting double for your money. You're getting all the talent that I bring, plus the cultural competency that I bring, and for what is going to be the future of America. We will be nearly a third of the population by 2060. So don't forget that you're going to need us. So.
Yeah, I've actually brought that up before, just like, in terms of the addition, in addition to, what all the things that I bring, I can also do it in 2 languages, and I'm getting paid as if I do it in 1. Right. So like those kinds of things, it's really, really interesting. And as I've moved up and moved around or whatever, I think knowing how to ask and advocate for myself is something that's helping me reclaim, that I am enough. And that's what spoke to me so much, Pabel, about what your mission and what you're trying to do in terms of redefining professionalism and the value that we all bring. There is a question about the term Latinx. I'm not sure I understand the label. Can someone explain it a little? And I see that Luz Maria responded, I think in the Q&A box, but I do want to hear what other people have to say. And there's a lot of resistance to that term where I work, and depending on who I'm talking to, usually someone who is not a millennial like myself. But I have heard a Gen Xer talk about Latinx in a way that uses this X as the intersection of at the intersection of all these things. Because to Abigail, your point earlier around, there is no room because we all belong, right? So there is no room for that homophobia, that racism, that classism, that elitism. So would love to hear from you guys all, or whoever wants to chime in on Latinx.
I'll chime in on this one, Veronica. If I can make one person feel more included by using the term Latinx, no matter how much it bothers someone that's middle-aged that prefers other terms, I will gladly use Latinx to make one person feel more included. And that's the way I look at it. I know the polling says that most don't even recognize the term, that don't like using the term, but it's as simple as that. And so even as a middle-aged man, and I think middle-aged in that case means I'll live to be over 110 years old. I think I've been middle-aged for a while now, but that I really just look at it that way. And the other thing is that we need to, like I said earlier, we need to be very mindful of inclusion within our own community. And that includes somebody that doesn't speak English, that identifies as Latino. That includes somebody that is outside of our community, but is a true ally. We need to include. and also the disability community, and that often get ignored by everybody, and the GLBTQ community, as well as sometimes you take for granted women feeling. I often say a middle-aged white man is very similar to a middle-aged Latino man. So we have to look at how we can break down our own systems of exclusivity in our communities to start, and then go outside of it, because we need to get our own community right before we start heading outside of it. And we really need to take a look at how we can be more inclusive within our own community. I've always said we need to define ourselves and not let anybody else define us, but we need to define ourselves more broadly. If we're so against building walls, why do we build them between each other?
So good.
As always, a +1 to what Tony says. He's truly my spiritual and advisor and everything. I want to add a nuance to this that just came to my attention recently. So I 100% what Tony said about if I can make one more person feel included, that has been my strategy. And that is why I interchanged actually Hispanic, Latino, and Latinx. However, I had an experience that I'll share with this group for the first time ever that has me confused and thinking. So I share this story and I open it to the group. An older-ish woman, let's just say middle-aged plus Latina woman said, I don't appreciate Latinx. It X's out my femininity. It's machista. It X's out my womanhood. I am Latina proudly. Don't take that away from me. And I was like, I never thought of it that way. So she said, please don't use that term with me. And I was like, okay, again, not intending to offend anyone. And I said, I know that's not the intention. And I did my best to explain and, what I understood Latinx to be saying as a much more inclusive. But I shared with her that I've been hearing of a trend in Latin America, which is the Latin @ symbol. And I don't know how to say it. I wouldn't know how you say. I know what arroba is, but do you say Latina arroba? I mean, I don't know how you actually say it, but to me, it has the A and the O and the everything in there. So I shared that and she said, I am much more comfortable with that because that's inclusive and it invites me in. The X keeps me out. So I mean, I know that is not the intention, but I just share that story and I share it with this group. And if anyone wants to comment on that, because it has my head and my wheels turning and I don't know what to do with it.
I think it's interesting that, I mean, it's an interesting point, I think it's interesting that we've become so accustomed to accept Latino as the default though, right? And with our language being so gender specific, isn't Latino already erasing the A in many ways, right? Because we have accepted that as a society as a default, right? So I don't know the right answer, but I've always felt uncomfortable even referring to Latinas as Latinos. You know what I mean? Like we never say Latina America, right? Or any of those things. So I don't know the answer, but I do know that there is a big divide. And I mean, what I do in my small business, at some point, I only use Latinx in advertising copy, for example, and I've received so much backlash. And eventually what I did was I just put Latino/Latina/Latinx. It just went away. And like, sometimes I feel like we just use, and again, I don't know the origin of Latinx. I'm a bit of a conspiracy theorist and believes that like some company just did it because they're lazy and they don't want to type it out. Also, maybe we're just lazy and we don't want to say, yeah, I'm going to meet up with some Latino, Latina, or Latinx friends. You know what I mean? But I don't know what the right word is, but I don't know.
Oh, you like hit it.
But what if
somebody
who's non-binary? You have to just.
Yeah, I was going to say.
Oh, okay.
I was going to say that like as a non-binary person, I find Latinx way more just like comforting, right? That for the first time in a really long time, Latino communities, Latinx communities are including gender expansive people. That we're not kind of like tossed to the side, like, oh, you don't really exist, even though we do, and we always have, right? Like everybody has a Theo or Theo, and we just don't talk about it, right? And so the fact that it's like at the forefront, but I also get the fact that you cannot give somebody their label. Like you cannot give someone Latinx when it is not theirs. And so if somebody says to you, like, I am Latina, then girl, you go, you're Latina 100%. And I'm Latinx, and that's cool. Those are the spaces that we inhabit, and we can come together. But again, we can only have labels that feel comfortable to us. We cannot give anyone a label. So
for me, it's
plus one on that, plus one.
So Eli, for me, it's more of just, generally speaking, if I'm talking to a man whose pronouns are he, I'm going to say Latino if I'm talking about somebody specific. But if I'm talking to somebody that's non-binary, or somebody that doesn't accept, like the person that Abigail was dealing with, that didn't like Latino to represent a Latina, I just adjust. It's just so easy to just adjust. And a lot of people don't want to adjust. They feel that's being that's being somehow violated, that they're forced to adjust. But you should be when you're talking to a human being. You can pick what you want people to call you. You shouldn't pick what you will call other people. And I remember on one of the things that one of these charlas that we did, I used the term charla orador, and I put X and then S. And I had a young woman call me crying, saying to me, thank you for doing that. It really means a lot to me and my community that your intention, that you were mindful, because she had actually brought it up to me a couple of years ago. And I'm talking about when she was like 21 years old, brought up to me why, when I would say things like our brothers and sisters, my intent was to be inclusive. And she said, well, you need to also look at our non-binary siblings. And so I changed the way I addressed people from that. And for her to see 2 or 3 years later, a viejito that turns around and remembered what she had said, it really made her very emotional. So again, those are my rules on all of this: is you have a choice what you want people to call you, respect others' choices. And when you're talking about lumping everyone in, try to figure out the best way to include everyone.
Agreed.
And I think, sorry, Pabel, you want to go?
No, I just said agreed.
Yeah.
I was just going to jump in here and say, I think this is a great conversation. And I think, from Antonio's perspective, it got me thinking about the evolution of language and how we all need to be very, very cognizant of that. I mean, let's take even into consideration the conversations here in the US about the evolution of the word, when we were referring to people as Negroes or Blacks, and then eventually African Americans. So even that language has evolved. And I think that what's happening is that for us, our language is evolving. And, those of us that work for AARP and those of us that work for those individuals that are 50 plus, I think it needs to be that conversation as well, that it is an issue of identity. It is a way that, we are starting to basically self-identify, and that we also need to take that into consideration.
Yeah, I love that. I love that you brought up identity too, because oftentimes, and this is the conversation to have it in, right? Belonging, it's so tied to our identity, and our identity is so personal to who we are uniquely. And I think for those of, at least as someone who works in marketing, we're often doing things that are not identity specific. They're race and demographic specific, or ethnicity specific, and they're based on assumptions that we make based on research, which is fine. But at the end of the day, that individual is not walking around constantly, thinking about whatever box we're putting them in. So I think that was a great conversation. And I think we're at 5:30, which means we can end close to on time, 5:32. So I just want to thank everyone for being here. And really, now that we're just at the end of the program, thank AARP for the support. Thank Denise Soler Cox. Thank all of you for joining us today. And thank you so much to Tony and the team at Hispanic Heritage Foundation. Thank you so much. Please look out for future invitations from HHF on upcoming programs. I hope you all have a great weekend. And to those who have someone, happy Mother's Day. Enjoy your family this weekend. Thank you.